So what is the new mission of Facebook?
Our society is still very divided. So our new mission is to bring the world closer together.
Cambridge Analytica.
Cambridge Analytica scandal.
It has all the hallmarks of a spy thriller. A Cambridge scientist invents a new method of political mind control. A secretive agency in London, run by an old Etonian called Alexander Nix, weaponizes the research and sells its services to the highest bidder. Our personal secrets, hoarded by Silicon Valley, are used against us to target our deepest fears and manipulate us. A new generation of populists and strongmen are swept into power. Only a plucky journalist called Carol can stop them. By now, lots of us have heard at least part of the story of the Facebook election scandal. Cambridge Analytica, the company in the eye of the storm, has closed its doors and is under investigation. But how effective were its methods? Can psychographic micro-targeting really swing elections and referendums?
You're listening to Polarised. I hope you're already impressed by the fact that Ian's able to say the phrase psychographic micro. I can't do it. That's how impressive it is. This is a podcast from the RSA. We're trying to understand the forces driving us further apart and what can be done about them. It's presented by Ian Leslie and by Matthew Taylor. As always, our podcast, Polarised, it isn't actually about orchestrating an argument between people with opposing views, lots of opportunities to listen to that kind of thing. But we're about understanding the polarising political moment we're living through right now, more about light than heat. In this episode, we're taking you inside Silicon Valley's persuasion machine. But before we get stuck into the big questions you've posed, Ian, the story, it's a complicated one. It's about psychology, social media, safety of our information, political advertising, the murky world of highly paid political consultants. For anyone who doesn't know the full story or hasn't gone into it in depth, can you just explain to our listeners from the beginning, where does this story start?
Okay, so this story goes back a long, long way. All the way back to 2015, when a researcher at Cambridge University, a psychologist, came up with a way of matching people's personality profiles to their behaviour on Facebook. Personality psychologists use the simple model of personality sometimes called the Ocean model. It's an acronym. They say there are kind of 5 well-established traits that are pretty much stable throughout your lifetime. Everybody is somewhere on the spectrum on all of them. So agreeableness.
Item 1, a cheery disposition. I am never cross.
Neuroticism.
I am not here for rage. I'm here for revenge. Excuse me. Am I talking to you, Pinhead? Am I?
Openness to new experiences.
I want to learn the ways of the Force and become a Jedi like my father.
Extroversion.
I'm going to show you how great I am.
And conscientiousness.
You must be kind. I am kind, but extremely firm.
So that's the kind of personality model that these guys work with.
Can I just interrupt for a sec? You see, I'm immediately going, well, hang on. I'm agreeable some days and I'm not agreeable other days. But the psychologists say there is a kind of baseline agreeableness to me.
Yeah. So they're not saying that you are always one of these things, that they're just saying you will spend more time being agreeable on average over your lifetime than people who are, so it's a very broad brush, very kind of simple, rough guide to personality. And some people question its value, how much is it really telling you? But it is kind of fairly well agreed on, well established in psychology. So somebody came up with a way of profiling you on that model based on what you're liking on Facebook. So, users who liked the Hello Kitty brand tended to be high on openness and low on conscientiousness, that kind of thing.
I really don't want to believe this, but go on.
And the way that they'd come to this conclusion was deploying an app on Facebook, and once people opted in, the app assessed their personality traits via a quiz.
Do you work hard?
Do you experience your emotions intensely?
Do you have a lot of fun?
Do you radiate joy?
Do you sympathize with the homeless?
Do you believe that others have good intentions?
Do you like poetry? Do you dislike yourself?
Do you panic easily?
Do you fear for the worst?
Do you yell at people? Do you love a good fight?
Do you believe there's no absolute right or wrong?
Do you go on binges?
Do you enjoy wild flights of fantasy?
Do you tell the truth?
Do you get angry easily?
Do you believe that you're better than others?
Do you dislike change?
Are you afraid of many things?
And then it correlated those answers with things that they liked in inverted commas, as you do on Facebook. So another psychologist came along, another academic at Cambridge, copied and sold that data to the company that would spawn Cambridge Analytica. And at the time, Facebook allowed apps to collect data on users' friends as well. So they ended up with data on 87 million people.
Cambridge Analytica.
Now, it sounds kind of horrific until it sounds slightly less horrific when you think that this is going on all the time. This is basically how the internet works, the ad-driven internet. So, commercial companies are picking up data on you via cookies all the time, and it's very straightforward for them to profile you, your personality on that basis. With this kind of similar technique. Whether or not they do so is another question, because we don't know really how useful this stuff is.
Because it's been used as much by unsuccessful politicians as successful politicians.
Okay,
we're obsessed by Trump, but we don't talk much about Ted Cruz.
Exactly, or indeed, Hillary Clinton, who invested a great deal of money in micro-targeting. Whether or not she did psychographic micro-targeting, I'm not sure. But so that is the next question, actually, right? So this is a technique that can be used. Commercial companies probably use it to some extent. Is it useful? And specifically, does it really work in a political context? It's much, much more likely, I think, that micro-targeted ads reinforce what people already believe. It's
but
very
that's problematic.
unlikely.
But I mean, that's
something.
Later on, I think I'll be talking about some interesting research about the way in which people are convinced by arguments when they believe passionately. So the very process of reinforcing people's beliefs is kind of problematic, isn't it?
I agree, but then what you most often hear about Cambridge Analytica and similar kind of phenomena like this is there's this giant sort of invisible force out there which is changing people's minds, which is persuading people to vote for a certain candidate or vote a certain referendum. So it's kind of mind control, right? This has been a fear of people for sort of 60, 70 years. I think The Hidden Persuaders by Vance Packard was like 1957 or something like that. People have always thought that advertisers, commercial advertisers and now sort of political advertisers somehow can control what we think. Now, I think the evidence is very sparse on that point. They can influence us in different ways, but I think actually changing people's minds, particularly in politics, is incredibly hard. And actually, overall, there's no evidence that any political campaigning changes anybody's mind. Somebody recently did a meta-analysis of, I think, sort of 49 different studies in America on the effectiveness of political campaigning, and they found an effect of close to zero. So it's not just that micro-targeting on Facebook is unlikely to change people's minds. It's that all political campaigning is basically, I wouldn't say it's a waste of time, but, well, it's close to a waste of time.
So, Ian, before you kind of completely destroy the basis of the programme, which is to explore micro-targeting and its impact on us, I think we should try to get a perspective from someone who maybe is slightly less sceptical about its effectiveness than you, and thinking about how it could be used in the UK as a method. So last week, our producer, James, spoke to the research director of the Online Privacy Foundation, Chris Sumner.
We ran 5 studies that looked at why people differed psychologically. Then we looked at how you could target these different groups based on information known about their Facebook interests. Then we looked at how effective that targeting actually was. And then we ran a proof of concept with those ads. What we wanted to look at was, is there a potential that this kind of approach is actually effective in some way? And should we be concerned about it?
Very briefly, what did you do?
The statement we presented folks with was the nothing to hide, nothing to fear statement in terms of, online communication, surveillance and privacy. do you agree with the, essentially the nothing to hide, nothing to fear argument, agree or disagree. And the traits that we were interested in, because they come up time and time again, at least in political research, is the traits associated with authoritarianism. And largely in terms of Big Five personality, that would be the traits of openness and conscientiousness.
So the Big Five, this is a kind of commonly used psychological survey or test. In your research, did you do one of those surveys as well and then match that to Facebook likes?
We'd looked at the research, I think, from Cambridge, and they'd looked at the likes and personality and had distilled, okay, what likes does somebody who is lower in authoritarianism versus somebody in higher authoritarianism, what they like. So you could say that, somebody who reads the Daily Mail is more likely to be higher in authoritarianism. The work that the folks at Cambridge did went to a much more granular level, where you could see, for example, what sort of films you like, what that says about your personality. So for myself, for example, I really like the film Top Gun, and that then raised a question mark of, well, am I more conservative because I guess of the military association with the film versus other factors?
On that question of surveillance, if you know that someone is an authoritarian, what message would you target to them?
We split the group into high and low authoritarianism and then pro and anti-surveillance. And for the group that are high authoritarian, and we wanted to, if you like, increase the interest in surveillance technology, then we presented an image of essentially the 9/11 Ground Zero site, and we had the tagline of "Terrorists don't let them hide online." For the flip side of that, where we wanted to see what messages actually work on swaying them in a different direction, we used an image of the D-Day landings with the tagline, "They fought for your freedom, don't give it away."
What did you find out about the effectiveness of using that profile to come up with different tailored messages for different audiences?
We saw agreement drop from 36% to 25% in the low authoritarian group. But for the high authoritarian group, we saw that almost double, really, from 36% to 61% level of agreement. It worked effectively, possibly more so than I'd thought.
And so since the Cambridge Analytica story came out, of course, there's been swathes of media coverage about it, and then there's been a backlash, and some people have said, actually, what they did wasn't very effective. It was junk science. I just wondered what you thought about that sort of reaction to it.
We looked at how effective it could be, but what we don't have insight into is, well, what did they actually do, and was it effective for them? That I don't know. But yeah, there's also been some comments, and you just touched on that, saying that this sort of technique doesn't work and it's just sort of snake oil. Well, there are at least 3 studies that have looked at just the ad targeting, and all have found broadly similar sorts of results. There are a few researchers who have said, well, the effectiveness isn't that great. I think that is very valuable, because it actually does poke some questions at the research, and that's how science kind of grows.
Thank you so much for talking to me.
Sure, no problem. It's been a pleasure.
So, Ian, I've listened to that. You're a skeptic. I'm quite convinced. I mean, he's just showed a couple of photographs to these people and massively polarised their opinions.
Yeah, I'm more skeptical. Look, his point about Top Gun just sort of reveals the difficulty of reading people's personalities from what they like. The idea that if you really, really like Top Gun, you're probably a more conservative person is going to be news to millions of people. You can do this stuff in a kind of very big, broad, simplistic way, and you say, okay, if you are a person who is high on neuroticism or low on agreeables, are you more likely to click on this ad for something? Yeah, okay, maybe that person is. There's a world of difference between that and saying that you can persuade somebody of a different point of view or get them to vote in a certain way.
But isn't the point there that the process of reinforcing an existing position is much easier than the process of challenging an existing position. So maybe you agree with Chris, because what you're saying is it's very hard for this stuff to change people's minds. I think that's probably right, but it's not hard for this stuff to take people from a kind of 7 out of 10 conviction to a 9 out of 10 conviction that they're right. And given our concern about polarization, that's the problem, isn't it?
Yeah, I'm wary of attributing any real-world effect to this stuff. However, if there is some, I think it's much more likely to be on, kind of turnout motivation, getting people already on your side to actually do something. I think one of the ways it might be working is sort of social proof. So say you have an opinion that you think that you know is pretty verboten in public, sort of unpolitically correct, right, opinion about it. And then you see lots of stuff, on your Facebook timeline saying, you're right to think that all immigrants are terrorists. Then that makes you more likely to express your point of view, and that makes others more likely to express that. And the whole thing kind of shifts the barrier of what you can and cannot say. So I think this kind of stuff can influence the discourse, right, and make it more polarized. And I think that's what the Russian kind of strategy is. I don't think they set out to elect Trump. I don't think they set out to persuade people to vote for Trump versus Hillary Clinton. It's not what they're doing. They've ended up with Trump by accident almost. What they're trying to do is poison and polarize the politics of Western democracies. To help us get our heads around the political implications of online campaigning, we're joined by Martin Moore, Director of the Centre for the Study of Media, Communication and Power at King's College London.
What a great name for a centre. Media, Communication and Power. That's good.
Causes lots of angst, I can tell you, amongst the academic community. Using the word power is a very difficult word to use in academia.
Oh, Martin's book, Democracy Hacked, Political Turmoil and Information Warfare in the Digital Age, will be published later this year. Hello, Martin.
Good morning.
So let's start with Cambridge Analytica. It's hard to know exactly what was going on here, but in your view, was the psychological or psychographic profiling that they did, was it likely to be effective?
Just so you know, Martin, because you know the context of this, we're already disagreeing about this. I'm tending to think it is quite effective, and Ian says, I just want you to know that you'll be siding with one of us from the outside.
It's polarizing.
It is polarizing.
What is effective is understanding an awful lot about an individual and tailoring your message and your communication to what you know about that individual. And I think personality and the psychographics and the ocean, etc., is an aspect of that, which is potentially, I think, a critical aspect. I think at the moment, it's very difficult to find out both how much they used it, how effective it was, if they used it at all in some cases. But I think to dismiss the idea that we can that campaigns and candidates can better influence voters, and particularly, I'm talking about behavioural influence, by knowing much more about them, would be very naive.
I'm just writing that down. Very naive. That's good. Strong words, Ian.
Very strong words. So the behavioural influence. Tell me more about that. What behaviours are they?
Well, so I think one of the things that people misunderstand about the use of digital campaigning, and particularly of micro-targeting, is that they assume that we're talking really about persuading voters to vote a certain way, or to even change their opinion or to change their vote. That's not really the purpose behind it. The purpose behind it is much more behavioural, and by that I mean you are prodding or prompting someone to respond. Now that response can either be fundraising, so you might be just looking to raise some money. It might be trying to bring them on board in terms of as a volunteer or simply as a follower, if you're a Twitter follower or a Facebook follower, or it might be prodding them to go out and vote. And I think that's the key is how it evokes a behavioural response rather than actually persuading someone to do something.
Okay, so
that's really interesting. So this is more about mobilization than it is about opinion.
Exactly.
And we were just talking about this, that it then creates a reinforcing effect, because the point at which you turn your opinions into donation then turns you into somebody who self-identifies as the kind of person who doesn't just believe something but does something about it.
Exactly, and that's exactly what we've seen with, and not just in elections, but across the world, where you see people go up what's called this step ladder of participation. So in Egypt in 2011, people, it wasn't that Facebook caused a revolution; it was that Facebook was an incredibly accessible avenue for people to participate. And the first step was normally simply watching a video on Facebook. The second step was liking or sharing something. And then the third step was joining a group, etc. And gradually they stepped up this ladder of participation until eventually they walked out their front door and walked to Tahrir Square. And it's exactly the same way in elections. You get people to retweet something or share something, and suddenly they're invested somehow. And then you shift them up the ladder.
Okay, so let's talk about how this affects our politics, because it's quite interesting. You've got two what models there. It can be used for good and for evil, right? To put it very simplistically, right? So on the one hand, arguably, it helps that kind of bottom-up grassroots activism that you saw during the Arab Spring. On the other hand, once big institutions get hold of it, like political parties or people with lots of money, it can work as a kind of more of a kind of top-down mechanism to persuade people at scale, or to activate people at scale. So where do you see things heading? Is this going to open a new era of grassroots activism, or is it really going to be used as a tool for power and control?
Both. I mean, I think this is the classic thing. It's been going on for many, many years, money versus people. And traditionally you get people associated with the left and money associated with the right, although I think that's much more fluid now. But I think that we will see both in the future, and we already are seeing both. And it feels quite chaotic at the moment for that reason. I think we should remember it was only 2 decades ago that we were all talking about the disengagement from politics and lamenting the fact, and Robert Putnam bowling alone, etc. We were lamenting the fact that people were disengaging from politics. So I think you're right to say that in some ways this is a very hopeful and positive development, because more people are engaged and more people are active. But I think one of the issues we have at the moment is the systems, the digital systems I'm talking about, the platforms particularly, are structured in such a way that makes them highly vulnerable, both to gaming by motivated individuals, and to use and misuse by very powerful parties, corporations, moneyed interests, etc.
I also think the other role it plays is the role that all media plays, which is less about persuasion or even motivation. It's more about agenda setting. So what are the things that we are arguing about or feeling strongly about today? What are we talking about? Actually, that's the kind of the real role of mainstream media like the BBC or the Times, the Guardian, and I think it's now kind of playing out on Facebook.
Absolutely, and we see that in the way people flock towards one direction or another. And I think the part of the problem is that, again, coming back, I suppose, to polarization, is that that we know from research that once something gains some momentum in terms of its popularity and the number of people talking about it, then it snowballs. And that's, I think, particularly what you see in the relationship between mainstream media and social media. When we were looking at the election in 2017 and 2015, you'd watch a story sort of emerge nascently on social media, and then it would jump to mainstream media and become much bigger on social media, and then it would shift back to social media again and morph in different ways. And there's this curious interrelationship between the two, which I think means that you do get agenda-setting roles, but you also get a sort of a longer trajectory, funnily enough, for lots of those stories, because they keep going in waves and cycles through mainstream media and social media.
I think this interaction between mainstream media and social media is fascinating. I was at an event last night. Daniel Trelling was talking about his book about refugees, and he was talking about the famous picture of the boy on the beach that mobilized so much opinion, and that was put out there by some Turkish journalists who kind of refused the pictures like that. Taken all the time, and they're usually suppressed, but they said, no, this has got to be public. But it still hadn't really taken off. But then a couple of very prominent Twitter users with hundreds of thousands, millions of followers then retweeted it And then, of course, it exploded. So that's that kind of, it's the capacity of social media to immediately pick up on something in the mainstream media that drives it then viral, I guess.
Absolutely. And when you look at research with young people who when you ask them what stories they follow or how they pick things up, the remarkable influence of individuals, where previously it would have been a news outlet or a particular a news program. Now it'll be individuals on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or whatever it is, talking about it. And because they follow that individual and millions of others do, that then becomes their agenda. That then becomes the story that they think is the most important story of the day.
Okay. So to close, overall, are you an optimist or a pessimist when it comes to the influence of social media on politics?
I'm struggling to be an optimist. I have to say,
you're a pessimist.
Okay, I'm a pessimist. I mean, I think we're going through a period of really. I think we still have to come to terms with the enormity of the transition we're going through. I think we're going through this huge change, and actually we're kind of in the middle of it right at the moment. So we can't see where we're going to end up. I think at the moment, my worry is that there's such confusion and such anxiety that actually we're going to do things that actually shoot ourselves in the foot. We cause ourselves more harm than good.
Martin Moore, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So, I thought Martin was absolutely fascinating, but I'm also interested if you take this a bit more widely, the kind of techniques that we're talking about, kind of machine learning, A/B testing, these kind of ways of targeting and personalizing messages, and aren't just used by, political campaigns. They're used by people trying to sell us garden sheds. The RSA published some work a few days ago about AI and ethics, and one of the questions we asked people was how they felt about AI being used to flog them things, and on balance, people didn't like the idea. Do you think it's effective? Because I think if it is effective, if we have moved beyond that world, famously summed up, I think, by John Wanamaker, the first person to open a department store in America, who said, I know that 50% of marketing works. Problem is I don't know which 50% it is. Have we moved beyond that world into a world where advertisers will know much more about what is effective?
We keep thinking that we're about to move beyond that world, but we keep realizing that we. So for those that don't know, I also work in advertising as well as in big pod. And one of the interesting things about what's happened in the last 10, 20 years is that we keep thinking, well, now we've got all this data on people, we'll get much better at persuading them to buy what we want them to buy. And it hasn't worked out like that. First of all, having a huge amount of data is not the same as having kind of some real insight into what motivates someone or how they think or feel. And second of all, it's really hard to come up with something that's actually going to motivate them. So you can say, I have data on this person, I understand them, and therefore I'm going to write an ad that appeals to them. That first bit is dubious. The second bit is really, 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 really hard. I think what it does is it's effective in the last mile, if you like. So if you're already in the market for something, mentally you're alert, thinking about it, I'd quite like to get something, and then an ad pops up, and it kind of directs you to, okay, well that's quite useful. What it doesn't really do is kind of influence the fame, the cultural salience of a brand, right? So the fact that I have certain feelings about McDonald's, right? Everyone knows McDonald's, but you'll have some kind of emotional kind of affinity with it. You can't do that online.
So there seems to therefore be a kind of consistency to what we're saying here, which is that this stuff is pretty good if you're kind of on the edge of the cliff thinking about jumping off.
Yeah,
it's quite good about getting you to jump.
Yeah.
But if you're nowhere near the cliff, if you're sitting in the cafe, it's not going to get you off your feet and walking towards the edge of the cliff.
Before we go, in each episode, we are going to recommend something provocative and interesting that we've read. It'll often be something that isn't sort of top of your news feed, something we've dug up from somewhere, but just something that kind of shifts the way that we look at the world of politics. It'll quite often be from the social sciences, as is the case this week.
So, yeah, the thing that's fascinated me this week, and, Ian, it's only fair to say that the reason I'm aware of this is because it was in your excellent newsletter. By the way, I'm currently in a kind of GDPR honeymoon, which is I've refused to subscribe to so many things. Almost everything arriving on my inbox I actually want to read. And this will last for about 3 weeks, of course. But nevertheless, reading your wonderful newsletter, I came across this piece of work by a couple of cognitive scientists, Matthew Fisher and Frank Keel at Yale. And what they looked at was the way in which people's conviction about their opinion influences the degree to which they think that their argument is a strong argument. So basically what they showed was that if you believe you're right about something, you also exaggerate the degree to which you are effectively arguing the case for that thing. Now, the only thing that overcomes this is being forced to listen to alternative views. This is the only thing that then makes you be a bit more realistic about how convincing you are. So now, I just want to tell you why I love this research. I loved it because I'm doing my annual lecture in a few weeks' time for the RSA on deliberative democracy. And this was helpful to me in two ways. First of all, I'm obsessed by deliberative democracy. So I will stop random people in the street now and tell them about how important deliberative democracy is. So first of all, I thought, hold on, be a bit careful, because maybe you've fallen into this trap that you think your arguments are completely compelling, but that's just because you're obsessed by this issue. Secondly, it did reinforce my arguments, because a point about deliberative democracy as a methodology, things like citizens' juries, is it does get the participants to listen to both sides of the argument. So this research really reinforces the fact that political engagement is of a completely different order if people are required to listen to views that they don't want to hear. A current theme for us in these programs, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm very much agree with that. And I thought one of the interesting things that this made me think about, something I quite often think about, which is the difference between knowing about something and caring about it, and how the two are actually sort of almost antithetical to one another in some ways. That is, if you know very little about an issue, say immigration, then it's really easy to take a very kind of simplistic, passionate, angry stance on that and say, look, immigration is really bad. We need to stop it. Once you start knowing more about it, you think, well, okay, so it seems that some immigration is bad, some immigration is good. And basically the whole temperature of your kind of attitude to it lowers. Now, if you know a huge amount about one issue, you can become almost paralyzed. You can't take a position anymore because you can see all the sides at once. So you need some people kind of, there's some sort of happy medium here. At the moment, I think we've got this kind of polarization in society between the people who really know how stuff works and the people who just like to shout about it. It's like the kind of the difference between campaigning and governing. Those two skills are really kind of pulled apart now. So brilliant campaigners are getting into office with no idea how to govern, and people who are really, really good at governing can no longer communicate the importance of what they're doing.
Wow. Well, that's all we've got time for in this episode. If you enjoyed the podcast, please tell someone about it. If you want to get in touch, suggest a topic for a future episode, then you can email us at rsa.radio@rsa.org.uk. You can find us. You can psychologically profile us on Twitter. Ian is at Mr. Ian Leslie, and I'm at RSA Matthew. Just on future topics, one thing I want to pick out today, I'd love to do something on the polarization between people who think that they're like us centrist dads who, are rational and reasonable, versus people who actually think that being really passionate is an important thing, because we're in danger of a certain smugness, it seems to me. So let's get someone, let's get an extremist in to give us a hard time. Absolutely. That's what I want to do. But other people, send in your ideas. Polarised was presented by Ian Leslie, by me, Matthew Taylor. Thanks to Adana, Mark, Brummy, Tom and Laura from the RSA for lending their voices to this episode. The producer was James Shield, and we were brought to you by the RSA.